is Bean to Barstool, a podcast that looks at the intersections of craft beer and craft chocolate. My name is David Nilsson. I'm a professional beer writer and an advanced cicerone, and the creator and host of this show. The music for this episode is by my dear friend, indie folk musician Anna P.S. You can find out more about Anna's music in the show notes or at her website, annapsmusic.com. You can find links and information about our guests in the show notes as well. I hope you enjoy this episode of Bean to Barstool. Vanilla is a very familiar flavor for most of us. It's so ubiquitous, in fact, that the word is used as a pejorative for anything that is commonplace and mundane. But that's not being fair to this fascinating tropical spice, which can display a wide range of expressive aromas and flavors and can be used in unique ways throughout world cuisine. In North America and Europe, vanilla is most associated with desserts, pastries, and other sweet treats, to the point that vanilla is often taken to be sweet on its own. That assumption is turned on its head in many other global food traditions, however, in which vanilla can be used in savory or spicy dishes. Its heady but gentle profile allows it to work in support of a variety of other flavors. And it's of interest to this podcast because vanilla is used so extensively in craft chocolate and often in craft beer as well. Today we're going to hear from an expert in the science and cultivation of vanilla, as well as a brewer who is working with various single-origin vanillas in his beers to highlight the unique characteristics of each. Dr. Alan Chambers began studying vanilla in 2016 when he joined the Tropical Research and Education Center at the University of Florida. His task was to work with tropical fruit crops to better support growers in southern Florida, and he quickly gained interest and expertise in vanilla as a viable crop for the region. My colleague Jesse Bassard recently recommended Dr. Chambers to me when I went in search of a vanilla expert, for which I am grateful because this ended up being a fascinating and informative conversation. I started out by asking Dr. Chambers to introduce us to the vanilla orchid.
So vanilla is common around the world, all around the equator. The main commercial type is called Vanilla planifolia. That's its genus and species name. That comes from Central America, from Mexico through Central America and even into South America. It was cultivated by native people there, and then as part of the spice trade, actually then migrated around the world to today's major production areas.
So let's talk a little bit about how vanilla is grown. I think this is probably something most people don't know a lot about. So tell us, how is vanilla cultivated? How is it pollinated? Things like that.
Vanilla cultivation is really interesting. It is an orchid. A lot of people will buy ornamental orchids to grow in their houses. Vanilla, though, is an edible orchid, and it's also a vine. Vanilla itself usually is propagated by cuttings. So you'll cut off a section of the vine and you'll root that, and that's how you get another plant, and that's a clone. So it's identical to the plant you took it from. And that's how most commercial propagation is done to get large numbers of plants to grow. Those new cuttings need anywhere from 3 to 5 years to be large enough where they will actually start to flower. And every vanilla flower needs to be manually pollinated. That's because in its native areas in Mexico, Central and South America, there are what we believe are insect pollinators that will go around and transfer pollen from one flower to another, leading to bean development. Though even in the natural areas, it's not a very efficient process, is our understanding. And then you take the plant outside of its native area, and there are not native pollinators. And so those have to be manually done using a small stick like a toothpick. And so people will go through the plantations or the vanilleries and pollinate individual flowers every day for a number of weeks during the flowering season. And then 8 to 9 months later, the beans are mature, ready to pick, and then they will go through a harvesting process, curing, eventual shipment back to places like the United States or the European Union, and then it's extracted and then sold to consumers and as ingredients for the products we love.
That sounds like a very labor-intensive process. How many flowers are we talking about that laborers are going through and pollinating daily?
Tens to hundreds of thousands of flowers. One flower will give you one vanilla bean, with beans being a couple of grams each, and we're producing over 10,000 tons a year, a lot of beans, a lot of flowers, though much of agriculture does rely on large scale, massive production and trying to keep the prices down through efficiencies at whatever steps you can.
Is that what leads to the incredible expense of vanilla and why this is such an expensive spice?
I wouldn't say that the actual cultivation of vanilla is what makes it expensive. It's probably more related to some of the archaic development or lack of development for the crop. So I'm a firm believer in the application of technology to make our crop plants affordable, safe, and nutritious. Vanilla seems to be one that just hasn't received large scale attention for decades, like so many of our temperate crops, in terms of plant breeding or even innovations in the way the plant is grown. And so that was some of where our work focused. Vanilla also struggles with perennial problems that have to do with supply restrictions. So a major weather event can knock out a significant portion of the global supply, which drives prices up. When prices go high, lots of people will plant new vanillaries, and then those take a number of years to start producing. And then there's an oversupply of vanilla beans, and so prices drop, leading to other problems. And so this cyclical nature of boom and bust really creates problems for both the consumer in the end, but then also people that are buying the beans, making the vanilla extract. So it's not purely a genetic problem. It's not necessarily a growing problem, but it's because of how international trade is managed in response to severe weather events and drought and things like that.
You mentioned the curing process after harvest. What is that post-harvest processing like, and what does it involve?
Yeah, so a green vanilla bean doesn't have any real flavor or aroma to it. Maybe a little bit of grassy is what you would get from it. It has all the potential to make a delicious bean, but it has to be encouraged. This in nature might be a way for the vanilla bean to attract pollinators to come and sample whatever the aroma is, but then also disperse the seeds in order to propagate the species. For humans, what we'll end up doing is picking the green beans, and then there's a series of thermal treatments that will apply to the bean that basically disrupts the cells in the bean so that enzymes can find the right molecules that will give you flavor that makes the bean smell great. And so you apply heat and humidity and time, and when in the end, what you get are those wrinkled brown beans that you can see online or in the store that have that really nice vanilla aroma.
You mentioned you're an advocate for the use of technology, but I'm sure there's a range of ways this has been done traditionally. Would the beans just be laid out in the sun, or what are some of the other more traditional methods?
Yeah, vanilla curing, there's a few general ways that vanilla is cured. There's what's called the bourbon or traditional method. This comes out of Madagascar, where most of the world's vanilla comes from. This includes a hot water bath treatment. So high temperature water is first done to scald the beans, or blanching them, you might call that, in other places. And then high humidity and temperature is maintained in the beans for a couple of days, and then they're put onto racks and they're slowly dried over a period of months. In Madagascar, where labor is cheap, they'll actually physically move these large screened boxes inside and outside every day to slowly dry down the beans. Then there are other countries where they're trying to automate this process to get more control over the final product. So you can take a green vanilla bean, treat it improperly, and get garbage out at the other end. But if you are able to control some of those parameters of temperature and time and humidity, you can take beans that have a high potential to be delicious and then make sure you have a great product. And so some of this is done through controlled environment rooms, where the temperature and humidity are controlled in large batches, and that helps with the uniformity of the product. And we're seeing some of that work in Tanzania, as well as some of the islands in the Caribbean.
How far back do we have evidence of indigenous populations working with vanilla?
And there's some fascinating publications on the history of vanilla, going back to the Totonac people, the Aztecs even, and then as part of the Spanish spice trade as they were moving through the area there. There's evidence that these native people were using vanilla in some of their beverages, usually reserved for royalty. But even still, there are vanilla species that are not available on the international market that are still used by local people as part of their regular diets to flavor different things, their foods, their beverages.
With the work you're doing to improve some of the agricultural practices with vanilla, what do you feel that someone in your position can learn from an indigenous population or a traditional method of working with vanilla?
One of our biggest challenges is we don't know what we don't know in vanilla. And so there's so much diversity out there and so many different uses of vanilla that we can learn from, local people, native peoples all through North, Central, and South America. And what the crop means to them, I think, is it makes it a little more romantic. People like to understand where their food comes from and a little bit of history. I think it makes it more interesting of a story. But at the same time, we can benefit from hundreds, if not thousands of years of cultivation practices, hopefully to make a sustainable route for us going forward.
On a chemical and sensory level, what is the flavor of vanilla? What are we tasting?
The primary flavor of vanilla is vanillin. This is replicated synthetically for when you buy artificial vanilla flavor. That's primarily vanillin with a little bit of brown color wherever that comes from. You can also get it in clear versions. Whereas if you're getting vanilla extract from the bean, it's a bouquet of dozens, if not hundreds, of different flavor compounds. And all of those work together to give you a much more rounded vanilla flavor. And that's why people pay a little bit more for it, is because it's got this more full, more rich, and it's a better sensory experience for a lot of people, in the same way that a grape or an orange soda doesn't necessarily remind you of the fruit itself. We can look at the same way between the synthetic as well compared to the natural botanically derived vanilla flavor.
Is that synthetic vanillin chemically identical to what is actually coming from the plant?
To a part of it, yes. So in the vanilla extract, you'll have dozens or hundreds of odorants, and the primary one is vanillin, which is going to be chemically identical at the molecular level to the synthetic. The synthetic is usually derived from petrochemicals or through some other feedstock, maybe a waste product from a paper mill industry where you get a very cheap starting material. It goes through some type of process, and in the end, you are purifying pure vanilla.
You mentioned that the raw beans don't really have much aroma. What is actually happening that is expressing all of those chemicals that are aroma active at the end?
The vanilla bean or the vanilla plant is more interested in dispersing of its seeds than it necessarily is in making maybe our ice creams and baked goods taste delicious. And so it's about timing for the plant. What the plant needs to do is to make sure that its seeds are ready to be dispersed into the environment. So if it attracts something to eat, say the bean, before the seeds are ready, now those seeds aren't going to have a chance to be dispersed and to grow into new plants. And so the plant itself is preparing the bean to develop all of those flavors by keeping enzymes and what the enzymes turn into, the aroma compounds, separated. You might think of this like one of those glow sticks that you buy in the store. You crack them. It's only when you crack it, you get the glow. And so it's at the right place at the right time. I want to get this light from the glow stick. The vanilla bean does the same thing by putting two different compounds or enzymes or whatever in different places. And then when it's ready to be ripened, the seeds are ready, and then it breaks, almost physically, that separation. And now you get the evolution of flavor.
That's fascinating. You mentioned the one primary genetic variant that provides most of our commercial vanilla. What are some of the different genetic variations or regional variations that you might see?
So there are over 100 vanilla species around the world, different colors, shapes, sizes. There are leafless species, which are just these green stems growing. We have 4 native species in southern Florida, where I was doing this research. Some that sprawl over the mangroves, full sun, very salty environment, and yet they're still able to grow there, which is absolutely amazing. There are also non-aromatic species, and so you'll cure the beans and there's no flavor that comes out of them whatsoever, so they don't rely on those aroma compounds to disperse their seeds. Outside of vanilla planifolia, there are a few other species that do produce a nice vanilla extract. So one of those is vanilla tahitensis. So this is an aromatic type that is commercially approved, and you can find this usually online. It's a little more rare than, say, in your local grocery store. And then there's vanilla pompona, which is even more rare, which gives you a unique sensory profile. Some people describe it as a little more raisiny. To me, it tastes more sweet than the typical type, which is one of the ones I prefer. There's also vanilla odorata, which, as its name implies, gives a nice flavor profile with some more anise flavor notes, which you can distinctly tell these apart if you were to have them all in front of you. And that's just a small sampling of the various opportunities that are out there for niche and novel vanilla flavor.
Vanilla, of course, is grown in many different countries around the world, as you mentioned earlier. Are the main commercial varieties all the same main variant, and they're just getting different characteristics from the soil and the environment, or what accounts for the differences between those?
Most of the vanilla grown around the world is clonally descended from early foundational clones. So what that means is someone took one plant from Central America a few hundred years ago and then propagated it. And then most of what's being grown is clonally, genetically identical or near identical stocks from those original clones, which has a lot of risk associated with it. That helps in some ways with having a uniform production system because most of the plants act the same. While there might be some small differences based on geography, mostly we see genetics driving a lot of those differences. So vanilla tahitensis is actually a hybrid between the main commercial type and odorata, which is also aromatic. And then that is grown as a clone, especially in Tahiti and Indonesia through there. And that gives you a very distinct flavor. Whereas if you were to grow that in Madagascar, it probably still taste very much like tahitensis, even though you're growing it under a planifolia intense culture.
How environmentally sensitive are the sensory characteristics of vanilla? Like, if you were to take a genetic clone and move it in different places, would you notice those differences after harvest?
The difference is taking one vanilla plant and growing it different places might be a little more subtle. And what we'd anticipate is that some of the ratios of the major flavor compounds would probably stay similar. The relative abundance, though, can be impacted from anything from watering to solar radiation to nutrient availability. Whether the average consumer would be able to tell a difference in that, like they do in wine, to say, oh, this tastes reminiscent of this region versus another. I don't believe we're there in vanilla yet, though I know people are interested in what impacts that can have in creating a regional specific product that can then support different geographies.
We'll be right back.
Hey everyone, Final Gravity Issue 5 is now available in the shop on beantobarstool.com. This 5th issue of our zine telling personal, human-centered stories from the world of beer is full of great articles. Bano Segudu tells the story of the South African beer style Umkombothi, poignantly explaining its role in her culture and the importance in her family's celebrations and milestones. Maria Krugliak writes about discovering the Portuguese half pint after moving to Portugal during the COVID-19 pandemic. Amanda Bruns and Obakeng Malope discuss the water spirit Mamuhaswa and the collaboration beer they brewed in her honor. These and numerous other stories fill the 56 pages of this zine. We've expanded it and added a few features for this issue. It's full color, full of lots of beautiful photography and art. Definitely check this out. It's on beantobarstool.com/shop. You can purchase this issue or subscribe, and you can always support us on Patreon and get extra perks as well. Cheers. Talk a little bit about the challenges you're facing trying to develop cultivation of vanilla in southern Florida.
Cultivation of vanilla in southern Florida is challenging specifically because it was new. Every step along the way was challenging because we couldn't just order up 10,000 or 100,000 plants to start with. And when we did start, we found a number of unanticipated challenges, including the prevalence of viruses. And the viruses can kill the plant, but generally they weaken them, and they don't display symptoms until the plant starts to die. So we had to find clean material. We had to find material that would grow well in our environment. So Southern Florida is distinct in its growing environment from, say, Mexico or Madagascar or India. And so we had to screen a lot of material to figure out what would do well under our climate and what produced large beans, good number of beans, and beans with a good flavor. After all of that work, only then could we start to figure out, okay, how do we get tens of thousands of these plants so that a grower who's interested could put in an acre or 5 acres of vanilla. And then we were also at the same time working on how do you grow the plant? How do you keep it healthy? What risks are there associated with hurricanes or drought or pests or diseases? And really the only way to figure this out is empirically. You have to be there actually growing the plants and watching them to figure out what problems you're going to encounter.
What are these plants like in the field? I mean, are they grown in rows? Is it a climbing vine? What is that actually like?
Most vanilla is grown under what's called a tutor tree system. And so you'll go into a forested area and then grow vanilla on the trunks of various trees or bushes. So vanilla is a shade-loving plant. And they'll let the plant grow up to about 5 feet or 2 meters or so, and then they'll loop the plant back down to the soil and go up again the tree. So you'll get these tufts of vanilla vines around a support structure. That works well in a lot of places, but in Southern Florida, where land is extremely expensive, we need a higher density than that in order to meet our price needs. So in Southern Florida, what you will see is an artificial shade canopy. This is a screen cloth like you would see on your windows to keep insects out. And then by changing the amount of material, you can vary the amount of light the plants are actually receiving. So that can be optimized. And then you'll see these grown on wire trellises. So if you've ever seen how grapes are grown or passion fruit, the vines will be supported on these wire trellises at much higher density. And it's also easier to get to the plants because they're in nice, clean rows.
Reminds me of how hops are grown for brewing.
So many crops, exactly, are grown with a minimal support structure and then in nice rows so that you can access your crop.
Would Florida naturally be in the latitudinal band for vanilla to be able to grow, or is there an additional challenge with that?
Growing in Florida is convenient because we do have those native species, so we know that it is a suitable environment for at least some species. Every growing environment has different risks associated for agriculture, and that's true if you're in Kansas or if you're in Brazil or if you're in Germany. So it's about understanding those risks and minimizing them. So for example, in Mexico, one of the biggest challenges they face, at least in the published literature, is reported to be drought. In Southern Florida, we have too much water from rain, from the canals. There's an excess of water. So drought isn't really a problem. It's accessible. It's easy to pump and to take care of your plants with water. Hurricanes are a problem, or cyclones in Madagascar. Hurricanes are a problem in Florida. One of the nice things is that usually hurricane damage is, at least in groves and trees, you start seeing that at plants that are 10, 12, and 15 feet. Vanilla is kept well below that. While the shade structure might be damaged, usually the vines do just fine in high winds. Probably the biggest challenges that you'll see in a place like Florida will be theft. So vanilla is a very valuable target for thieves, and we see that with other high value crops like sapote, mamey, mango, especially when you've got an agricultural area right next to a major city like Miami. There can be some spillover and challenges there. And so every region is distinct with its challenges. It's about managing those and then trying to put the best science forward to mitigate risk.
I never would have thought about theft. Is that organized in any way, or is that just individuals being opportunistic?
Well, and theft is a problem in Madagascar. It's a problem in Hawaii, where vanilla is grown. I once asked a vanilla grower in Hawaii what his biggest pest problem was, and he told me it was humans. So there's a certain level of this opportunism for theft. It is a perennial problem, especially in Madagascar, where the land is more communal in terms of access to and from. And so someone going through a field, it's convenient enough for them to snatch on their way through, with very little risk, high opportunities to sell that product, even if it's below normal cost. And that's going to be the same in Southern Florida. While security might be less expensive relatively in Southern Florida, it still is going probably to be a problem.
Are any of the native Florida varieties commercially viable? Can they be adapted in any way?
We look more at the native Florida vanilla species as ways to learn from nature, to learn from the genetics that they possess. So, for example, vanilla phantha is one of our native species. It does make an aromatic pod, but I'm not aware of any local people, native people that actually use it in their food. While that might be the case, I'm just not aware of any. So there might be some food health concerns there, some food safety concerns. Vanilla phantha, though, is resistant to one of the major fungal pathogens that infects vanilla planifolia. So we start to wonder if that genetic resistance can be transferred to vanilla planifolia. There's also another species, Vanilla mexicana, that is self-pollinating, doesn't require an insect or anyone to go in there with a toothpick to pollinate the flower. That trait alone could be hugely valuable to vanilla planifolia if you can figure out how Vanilla mexicana is able to do that uniquely among the vanilla species, and then transfer that into Vanilla planifolia. At the same time, Vanilla mexicana is very challenging to work with. It's a very sensitive plant. It is endangered, so you can't legally work with it or collect it unless you have permits. It's also non-aromatic, so the bean doesn't produce any flavor, so not really useful in terms of extract, but it is beautiful. So very interesting species in terms of its ornamental value. So mostly we look at the natives for what we can learn from them, not necessarily for a commercial product on their own.
What do you think is most commonly misunderstood about vanilla in the general public?
One of the biggest misconceptions about vanilla, I would think, is the reason that it is expensive, or the challenges that have to be solved to get a product to the consumer in a cute little bottle that's safe and relatively affordable, as well as the understanding of how many people's lives are touched by a natural product like vanilla extract. The people at the grocery store, the wholesaler, and then going beyond that to the collectors, the growers, and all the families that supports. It's amazing with that small bottle, how many people's livelihoods that supports. And I think that's part of how fascinating it is, as well as the rich history of vanilla. It seems that as soon as we found vanilla as part of Western culture, it was distributed everywhere. I think there's just something in our DNA that really likes vanilla. And so I think it's got this nice staying power, as well as a rich history, for how it moved around the world and really captured our attention in terms of what it can do to make our food more delicious.
Talking about how many lives are touched, looking at other crops that grow in some of these same regions, like cacao and coffee, you have a lot of ethical and social concerns around farmers being paid, laborers being taken care of. Do we see similar issues like that in vanilla?
Vanilla certainly has similar issues, as well as accountability for sustainability and fair wages. A lot of this work is being targeted in Madagascar. I think historically, a lot of these very large multinational companies have invested significantly in Madagascar, in Malagasy schools, in supply chains. There's also some very real challenges that are still there. But understanding the whole supply chain, it's very complicated. Trying to get a product from Madagascar to the United States or the European Union, and then how you can make that equitable to make sure that the farmer at the very base level is able to improve their livelihood, to make sure they've got food on the table to send their kids to school. And I think that's been garnering increasing attention over the previous years, especially as you look at things like cacao and coffee. Very similar stories of what would be a minor burden to the average consumer in a Western nation could have a significant impact for the livelihood of a number of these growers.
Looking at cacao specifically, given that they originate in the same area and can be grown in similar areas, and this is a tree, can they be co-cropped at all?
I do know some people that are looking to co-crop vanilla and cacao. One of the challenges is the cacao pod is formed on the hard tissue of the cacao tree, and the vanilla, that's exactly where the vine grows as well. So you can't compete for the same physical space. We have a number of people that are looking at vanilla production under normal agroforestry systems. Avocados would be a good one because they're not competing for the same space. But usually, growers are very creative people all around the world. And if they see a piece of their real estate where they can get additional revenue on that, we see that type of exploration. And then they're the ones who are teaching us this worked, this didn't work. It'd be interesting if we could dig deeper into this.
Has cacao entered into any of your interest in tropical crops for Southern Florida?
I would certainly love to work with cacao. Unfortunately, it is too cold in the winter in Southern Florida for most cacao. There are a few species that are truly tropical that we can't economically produce in Southern Florida. And cacao is one of those. Breadfruit is another. There's a handful of others out there that the climate really doesn't justify the risk of any type of major investment. Though at the hobbyists, homeowner level, sure, there are people that have those, but you get a freeze event or even chilly temperatures, it really damages those tropical plants.
Finally, why have you devoted so much of your time to vanilla besides just, it's part of your job? What do you love about this? What do you find so interesting about it?
Vanilla really is just a fascinating species. It's addictive. When you get into something like that, the rich history, the huge potential, as well as the fact that I'm a heavy user of vanilla extract, especially now, it's easy to get passionate about something like that and to feel like I'm contributing to the body of scientific literature as well as livelihoods. While I could be focused on growers in Southern Florida, what I would hope is that through my networks and the research that we're publishing is that we could benefit growers wherever they are and other researchers as well, taking the tools that we develop and then using that to improve livelihoods. And there's not that many crops where you can really go from zero to something amazing in such a short period of time. And vanilla is certainly one of those.
As a heavy user, do you have a vanilla that you reach for most often?
I do. So my personal stash includes vanilla planifolia, which I got from Madagascar when I was there. Vanilla pompona, also from Madagascar. That's my go-to for when I've got a special event or when I'm down. That's what I go to. And I also have vanilla tahitensis, which my wife and some of my kids prefer, but for me, vanilla pompona is my go-to at this time.
And is that a variety? Is that something that most people would probably be able to access where they are?
You can purchase vanilla pompona online from a few reputable sellers. You don't see the extract. It has not been granted what is called GRAS status or generally recognized as safe. Food safety is very challenging, again, because you don't know what you don't know. And so in general, if you look at foods that have been consumed for hundreds of years, we generally recognize them as safe because so many people have eaten it for so long, we assume it's mostly safe, right? And so this is what is present for things like vanilla planifolia and vanilla tahitensis. But for vanilla pompona, we don't have that status where you can legally sell it as vanilla pompona extract because it hasn't been granted that status. And that's true for a number of different, mostly wild, rare plants. But certainly vanilla pompona is consumed by native peoples all around the world. So I thought it was relatively risk-free for my own self, especially because it is delicious.
Yeah. So you grow these yourself at your home, I assume?
We do. So we've got them at the research center. We have vanilla pompona at the research center. We also have growers that are interested in vanilla pompona, even with the challenges associated with the lack of this legal definition. You cannot call vanilla pompona extract, you cannot call it vanilla extract because the legal definition only allows planifolia and tahitensis. But again, growers in Southern Florida are excited about new, novel, and niche opportunities. And so Pompona is an interesting species. It grows fast. The beans are large. It's resistant to fungal problems that plague vanilla planifolia. So they think, why not? So then we go back again to zero and say, here's a collection of different clones we've collected, which ones grow the best, and then make those available to our growers to experiment with.
We'll be right back.
Hey everyone, my book on pairing craft beer and craft chocolate is available now on Amazon and on the Bean to Barstool shop. Pairing Beer and Chocolate, a guide to bringing the flavors of craft beer and craft chocolate together, is out now. This paperback book explains the process of pairing beer and chocolate, includes a guide to hosting a pairing at home, walks through dozens of beer styles to provide style-by-style pairing guidance, and gives room for taking your own pairing notes along the way. This is the only book on pairing beer and chocolate available. Grab your copy now at the link in the show notes or on Amazon. If you manage a tap room, bookstore, chocolate shop, or cafe and want to stock the book, get in touch about our easy wholesale process. Beer and chocolate belong together, and this book is your guide to getting the most out of every pairing. I know it's a very real problem that is causing headaches for growers, but I am fascinated by the idea of vanilla theft. The fact that people are sneaking onto farms to engage in vanilla heists is just wild. I did some digging online after our conversation and found that this is a major problem in a lot of places where vanilla is grown, including Mexico and Madagascar. It wasn't something I was aware of at all before this conversation. Vanilla gets used extensively these days in craft brewing, most commonly in dessert-inspired pastry stouts and related beers. These beers often include cacao, coffee, or other baking spices, so vanilla fits right in as a familiar flavor note. Because of its intended role in support of other flavors in these beers, most brewers are looking for a classic, recognizable flavor most people would just know as vanilla. But some brewers are highlighting the nuances of single origin vanillas by showcasing them in specific beers. At the 2023 Denver Rare Beer Tasting, I got in a conversation with Sean Buchan, the founder and head brewer at Denver's Cerebral Brewing. Sean was pouring Vanilla Rye Here Be Monsters, a 14.5% imperial stout aged in rye whiskey barrels and conditioned on a blend of multiple single-origin vanillas. The beer was a liquid tribute to the amazing vanilla orchid, and I recently reached out to Sean to talk more about this beer and his other beers highlighting specific vanillas. At the outset, I asked him to tell us about Vanilla Rye Here Be Monsters.
So that's the second time we've done that beer. Both have been a little bit different in terms of the base spirit barrels that we used, and then we did switch the vanillas out each time. I mean, in part because we like trying new products and we're always exploring new vanilla varietals. So it was nice for us to kind of get a showcase of three new ones. The first time we did that batch, it was, if I'm not mistaken, Madagascar, Tahitian, and Ugandan, trying to play in a lot of different flavor profiles and blend so that we could really create the most unique vanilla experience possible. And then this time we used Peruvian, Hawaiian, and Marquesas Islands vanilla in a base imperial stout that we aged in Thomas Handy Sazerac barrels for 31 months.
So using all those different origins, let's talk a little bit about the variations in those and the flavors and aromas that you're going to get. I think when most people hear vanilla, they have one particular thing in mind just from, typical baking use. Talk a little bit about some of the differences in the sensory characteristics of those origins.
I mean, we kind of went into it thinking the same thing when we first got into using vanilla. I'm not a baker, so I'm not, I didn't have that background knowing that there was dozens of varietals out there for us to choose from. But in terms of the first batch that we used, I think that was the most clear distinction between varietals. Madagascar vanilla is, by all accounts, pretty much what anybody would imagine when they're thinking vanilla. It's, it's sweet, it's creamy, it's give you a little bit of that marshmallowy vanilla, but it's not over the top. I think it kind of hits all notes. Ugandan is a really cool one in that it offers some depth and woody notes. I always think of it as like a milk chocolate raisinette because you get some really dark fruit in there, um, mixed with some of what you would normally associate with vanilla. And then the Tahitian is more, to me at least, like the inside of an Oreo. It's got that like cookies and cream um, character that we love to use. I mean, honestly, all of those are on the top of our list. But for the second batch, we have a provider, Jones and Co. out of, I believe they're out of California, that they source from all over the world. And we took 4 of their 5+ rated vanillas and we put 1 pound into each oak barrel that we used. And ultimately, one of those vanillas didn't end up making the cut into that final beer. Nothing against that vanilla origin. It was just a little too, it came across as very perfumey, and it just wasn't what we were going for in that base beer. But that was the first time that we'd used a lot of those vanillas. So we were kind of going in blind. And I think from memory, we really liked the Peruvian was a really big bean. Like the bean size changes so significantly between origins. That was surprising as well. But it had so much of that vanilla caviar on the inside. But we also got a little bit of spice from it, like almost a little bit of baking spice, something that you'd associate with like Mexican hot chocolate. So we really like that depth on the back end. The Hawaiian also came across as more of a brighter vanilla for us, something maybe a cross between how we associate the Tahitian and the Madagascar. And it just kind of covered that top note for us in this beer. And then the Marquesas Islands was really just that cream. Yeah, I guess that like marshmallow depth and like cream filling is how I describe it.
Do you find that the aromas that you get from the vanilla itself, as just holding it in your hand, comes through pretty directly in the beer, or is that change at all in the process?
It's pretty direct. The one that we used, it was a Guatemalan bean, and it was a really great bean. It smelled great. We've used it in other projects, and it turned out well. For whatever the case was, it just came off as really perfumey and had like almost like a extracty alcohol note to it in the beer. So I can't, I don't know that one, but the other ones, for what it's worth, I feel like it's a pretty direct 1-to-1.
So when you're blending multiple different origins together, does that kind of iron out some of those differences? I mean, what goes into selecting a different blend of those rather than just a single origin?
Yeah, it can. I think we always look at it, and we do trial blends on these too. So a lot of them, we will do individual oak barrels dosed with a vanilla bean so we can really get a good idea of what we're getting out of that bean. Tend to go on the lighter end in dosing and then just use time as our extraction tool so we can kind of pull it when we get the character that we want instead of overdosing and there's no real correction there. So yeah, I think that we do the multiple blends quite often, and I think more often than not we're actually just getting more character. I don't really find that it like flattens them all out. It can if you go too far or you use vanilla beans that do not work very compatibly. I think if you have some that are all achieving a very similar flavor profile, you're going to get a pretty flat vanilla character in that space. But if you're really looking for that like cream note, a little bit of that like classic marshmallow that people always want out of vanilla, but a little bit of those complementary wood, leather, tobacco, chocolate characters that you can actually get out of vanilla, I think that's where you get the most complex character.
Given that this beer in particular, the Here Be Monsters, was aged in rye barrels, vanilla obviously is a note that you can get from oak aging. Do you find that the vanilla amplifies the barrel character or vice versa, or are they just parts in a whole?
Oh, definitely. We pick barrels specifically for vanilla. So we do shoot for barrels that already have a little bit of that character so that and we do that with all adjuncts. If a barrel set isn't really exemplifying any characters of what we're about to put in it, we find it just doesn't work as well. Unless it's a beer that we're hitting so hard with adjuncts that we're not using the barrel as a focus. But most of our barrel aged beers showcase barrel origin and barrel character first, and then we're using vanilla and other adjuncts to supplement that. So we're looking for that vanillin from the oak as a character, and if those barrels meet that direction, great. Then we start moving in that space and complement it.
Can you talk a little bit about how this actually gets used? How are you adding vanilla and at what point?
Yeah, so we do it on our barrel aged beers in particular. We add it into the oak barrel, and we've tried different methods. We've always done hand processed, and then at one point it just became so labor intensive that we were hoping that running it through a Vitamix or something like that would speed up the process and give us the same or better extraction and flavor. Unfortunately, the testing that we did showed that the hand processed vanilla was always superior, in our opinion, on from a flavor perspective. So what we do is, and that's probably one of my remaining jobs that I still take on myself for all of this, but it's just slicing vanilla beans directly all the way through. Use a spoon, scrape out the caviar, and then chop the beans up. So that way we get really good surface area extraction, pull all the caviar out, and then we're trying to maximize that surface area that's open to beer from the inside and outside of the bean.
And so how long does that end up in contact with the beer?
1 to 3 months, depending on how well I planned.
Sure. Do you have other origins that you are wanting to try, or other projects or ways to use vanilla that you want to try?
Yeah, in terms of origins, there's always like the super, quote unquote, hype vanilla beans that I would love to try out. I don't think that equates to quality in all aspects, but I think they look fun to play with. Some of the Brazilian beans are just massive in size, and I think it'd be fun to play with. Plus, they're easier to process because the small, thin ones are just so much more work. So we'd love to do that and play around with some of those more like rare beans, but in general, I think we're really just enjoying the fact that there's probably 20 vanilla varietals out there we haven't even tried yet that we're looking to get our hands on and start playing with. And we've also found some that we've really, really enjoyed that we're going to continue to use year to year, because it is an agricultural product. So every year you're going to see slight variations in that bean. You can't just write it off as one flavor profile.
On the consumer side of things, do you find that your fans respond to the storytelling of, we used this particular origin, or we used these different origins in this beer?
Yeah, I think so. Especially the higher end products that we do. We do use vanilla in like some IPAs and things like that as a supplementary adjunct to drive a certain character in the beer. But I don't think that gets more lost, the storytelling there. But I think when we've used it in mixed culture beers in the past, when we've used it in barrel aged stout, I think people really do care about where we're sourcing ingredients from and what that flavor profile is.
I want to talk briefly about cacao. I believe you've used that in a few different beers. Can you talk a little bit about the cacaos that you've used in brewing?
Yeah, we've used cacao nibs for quite a while and gone through a few different sources. We've definitely got our favorites there. We don't have the same variety to choose from the sources we've used, which is honestly kind of helpful. There can be a paralysis by analysis when you look at a 2-page sheet of vanillas that you haven't worked with before. But we work with right now a chocolate provider, I believe they're out of Illinois, called Ethereal, and
Sure.
we've really enjoyed almost everything we've gotten from them. But I'd say our absolute favorite when it's in stock is the Filipino cacao nib. It's just what we're looking for with that, similar to coffee, is a low acid cacao nib. So we're looking for that heavier roast, heavier chocolate, milk to dark chocolate notes with any of the depth that we can get outside of that. And that Filipino one is just so fudgy that it
Is that
works
the new
beautifully.
Malinabulong origin from Philippines?
I don't know. We don't get the specific origin on the cacao
Okay.
nib bag, so it could be. I just know that it is newer to them. I think it's been the past year and a half, 2 years we've been using it. So they're just listing, the country origins. That's all we see on the bulk bags.
Yeah, that is a newer origin to them, and it looks like a really exciting option, kind of like Ghana, where it's just going to give you that straight ahead chocolate
Yep.
fudge flavor.
Yeah, Ghana's another favorite, and then Belize is also a big hit for us with a little bit more of that red fruit note in there.
Cool. What story are you telling with vanilla?
I mean, for us, I think it's similar to stories that we tell with other agricultural products. With our IPAs, we're telling the story of hops and hop origins, and the labor of the farmers and the labor of everyone involved in the process of that. And with vanilla, I think it's the same thing. We don't have any direct relationship based on the location of where vanilla is grown and our travel budget, frankly. But we'd love to showcase the same thing. Like, this is an agricultural product that changes year over year. A lot of these vanilla farmers are subject to extreme climate changes and, heat, drought, and things that really affect their livelihood. So our ability to source incredible vanilla beans from areas of the world that need that income through an importer that makes sure that they're getting paid a living wage for that product, and telling that story all the way to the consumer so that they're able to realize, that then we now have customers that talk about what vanillas they enjoy. And I think that's just something that we didn't see in beer 10 years ago. And there's a lot of good breweries telling that same story. So I think it takes, the whole industry, but I think we're getting to a point where people realize the value in paying for something like this and the work that goes into it.
If you want to hear more about Ethereal, the company Sean sources his cacao from, you can go back and listen to episode 8 when we interviewed Michael Irvin and Marisa Allen of Ethereal to talk all about their company and the philosophy behind what they do. I'll link to that in the show notes. While I've done some asking around, I have not been able to find a bean-to-bar chocolate maker working with different single-origin vanillas to highlight their characteristics in chocolate, which really seems like a missed opportunity. If you know of a maker doing this, or if you are a chocolate maker and you agree that it would be an interesting project, please reach out and we'll talk about it. I hope this episode helps you appreciate how unique and varied vanilla really is. Far from being an avatar for homogeneity, vanilla is a fascinating and diverse spice with a wide range of expressions that reward attention. Thanks to Dr. Alan Chambers and Sean Buchan for coming on the show today. Thanks to all of you for listening. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Bean to Barstool.